Welcome to Rain Narrator channel where we take you on a journey of deep relaxation and complete tranquility with the sound of raindrops adding an atmosphere of tranquility and comfort. Relax, enjoy, and prepare to enter the world of dreams. If you are looking for an ideal way to relax or calm your mind before sleep, you are in the right place. Follow us to get the best stories. It all started on a quiet autumn afternoon. The world seemed to slow down as the sun's golden rays cut through the trees, casting long shadows across the street. I was walking home from work, my mind preoccupied with the mundane details of life, things I'd been thinking about for years. Bills to pay, responsibilities to meet, and a future that, honestly, seemed distant and uncertain. Life felt like a struggle, but I was okay with that. I had learned how to survive, even if survival meant accepting what I could never change. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on the steps of a worn-down building. Her clothes were simple, a little faded from time and wear, and her shoes had clearly seen better days. She looked down at the ground as though the world around her didn't matter. But when I saw her, everything around me suddenly did. It was like the noise of the city faded, and all I could hear was the beating of my heart. I didn't know why, but something about her, her quiet strength, her simple beauty made me stop. I walked over and, unsure of what to say, asked if she needed help. She looked up at me, her eyes a soft shade of brown that held a sadness I could almost feel. "I'm fine," she replied, though I could tell she wasn't. Her voice was quiet, almost like she didn't want to burden anyone with her problems. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was different, that she deserved more than the world had given her. I found myself going back to that spot the next few days just to see her. We started talking. She told me her name was Emily, and she worked as a waitress at a small diner nearby. Her life wasn't easy, but she was proud, never complaining about her circumstances. Her smile, though rare, was the kind of smile that made the world seem lighter. I don't know when it happened exactly, but I fell for her, slowly, gently, and in a way that felt like it had been building for years, even if I had never met her before. I remember one evening after the diner had closed, when she was walking home and I offered to walk her there. "It's not safe for someone like you," I said. She laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Someone like me?" she teased. "And who might that be?" "Someone who deserves more than this," I replied, motioning to the crumbling buildings around us. She didn't say anything after that, but I could feel her warmth, a quiet acceptance of my words. We didn't need anything extravagant. We didn't need fancy dinners or grand gestures, just our time together, simple moments in the park, sharing coffee at the small diner she worked at, walking under the streetlights, talking about dreams neither of us thought could ever come true. But like all things that seemed too good to be true, it began to change. His name was Victor. I remember the first time I saw him. It was a couple of months after Emily and I had become close. I had just finished my shift at the hardware store when I saw her talking to him outside the diner. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his shoes shiny as if they had never touched the ground. His smile was the kind you could never forget. Charming, magnetic, confident. He was everything I wasn't. Everything Emily deserved in the world's eyes. At first I tried to ignore it. He was a customer at the diner. She was just being polite. But then I started noticing the way she looked at him, the way she laughed at his jokes. And for the first time in months, I felt small. Like all my efforts didn't matter, like all the love I had for her wasn't enough. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs became clear. Victor would come into the diner, and Emily would act differently. She would dress a little nicer, her posture a little more poised, and one day I overheard a conversation between them. He was talking about taking her to a fancy restaurant, about how he could change her life. She looked down, a small blush creeping up her cheeks as if she were flattered. I was hurt. I didn't understand. Was I not enough? Was my love not enough? It wasn't long before things began to shift between Emily and me. She started making excuses. She was too busy at work. She had to run errands. She couldn't spend time with me as much anymore. I felt the distance between us grow, and each time I tried to get closer, she pulled away. My heart ached with every conversation that turned cold. Every moment I could see her slipping further from me. One night I went to the diner after my shift, hoping to see her, hoping to talk to her, to understand, but when I walked in, she wasn't there. Instead, Victor was sitting at a booth smiling as if he owned the place. He waved me over, a friendly but smug look on his face. "She's busy tonight, man," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "But don't worry, she's in good hands. I'm going to take her places you couldn't even dream of." My heart sank. I wanted to stand up and walk out, to leave him and everything behind. But I couldn't. I couldn't let go of her so easily. Emily had become everything I had ever wanted, and the thought of losing her tore me apart. I waited, hoping she would return to me, that her feelings for me would outweigh whatever the money and glamour could offer her. But it wasn't that simple. The truth hit me like a cold wave one evening when I saw them together, walking down the street hand in hand, laughing as if the world belonged to them. And in that moment I realized that my love wasn't enough, not in the way it needed to be. She had chosen him. She had chosen the life he could give her over the life I could offer. And in her eyes I could see it clearly. She was no longer the woman I had loved. She was someone else now, someone I didn't recognize. My heart broke, but I understood. It wasn't her fault. She was just trying to survive, to find a way out of the life that had been so hard on her, and I wasn't enough to change that. I walked away that night, leaving behind the girl who had once been my everything. My heart was shattered, but I knew that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together. Life has a way of pulling us in different directions, and sometimes the people we love aren't meant to stay. Maybe one day Emily will find happiness in a life that I could never give her, and maybe in time I'll learn to heal. But for now, I'm left with the memory of a love that was real, even if it wasn't meant to last. It feels like it was only yesterday when I first saw her. Her name was Eliza. She had this way of walking, a kind of grace that made everyone take notice. Her smile was brighter than the sun on a spring day, and her eyes, those deep, sparkling eyes, held secrets that made me want to know everything about her. I was a nobody then, just a young man with dreams but no real prospects. But when Eliza looked at me, something in me stirred. It felt like she saw something in me that nobody else did. We started talking, at first just casually. We had a lot in common, both dreamers, both wanting more out of life than just the ordinary. I remember her telling me about her hopes for the future, how she wanted to make a difference, how she dreamed of traveling the world. She spoke with such passion that I found myself captivated. It was easy to be in love with her. She was everything I had ever wanted in a woman, intelligent, kind, ambitious. I guess it was inevitable that we fell for each other. The first time she kissed me, I felt like my world was turned upside down. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the promise of something real, something lasting. We were young, so young, and I thought we had all the time in the world. Eliza would be mine and I would be hers. And then, one evening as we walked through the park beneath the stars, she turned to me and said the words I had been waiting for. "I want to marry you, James. I want to be with you forever." I couldn't believe it. She said it so simply, yet it felt like my heart had been set alight. I knew I loved her, but hearing her say that she felt the same way, it was a moment I would never forget. I promised her that I would do everything in my power to make her happy. I would build a life for us, no matter how hard it would be. But you know, life never goes as planned. Things changed slowly at first. It wasn't as if there was one specific moment where I could point to and say, "This is when it all went wrong." It wasn't that simple. It was 1,000 small things. The way her eyes would linger on certain men, the way she started dressing differently, more fashionably. She began spending more time with people I didn't know, people I wasn't comfortable with. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, but deep down I knew something was shifting. Then came the night when she told me about him. His name was Edward. He was from a wealthy family, had connections, money, everything that I didn't have. Eliza told me about him casually, as though it was just another friend. But I saw the way she talked about him, the way her eyes sparkled when his name came up. I could feel something change inside me, a quiet but painful certainty that I was losing her. I confronted her, though I wish I hadn't. "Is there something going on between you two?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, her face soft but distant. "James, you know how much I care about you, but Edward is different. He can give me everything I've ever wanted, security, opportunity, a future I can't have with you." My heart sank. The words she said were like daggers. "So that's it? You're leaving me for him?" Eliza looked away, her lips trembling. "I don't want to hurt you, James, but I can't keep living like this. I need more. I need a future, and Edward offers that. You're amazing, but you don't have what I need." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had promised my heart to, the woman I had dreamed of spending the rest of my life with, was telling me that I wasn't enough. And what hurt the most was that I knew deep down that it wasn't just about love anymore. It was about money, status, a future that would never come to pass with me. I tried to understand, but how could I? She was leaving me for a life of luxury, for a man who could give her everything I couldn't. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying the truth. The worst part? She didn't even apologize. She didn't try to make things right. She just walked away, her hand slipping from mine as she disappeared into the world of wealth and power, a world that had always been out of my reach. Months passed, and I heard about Eliza's engagement to Edward. I saw the pictures on social media, her radiant smile, the diamond ring on her finger, her life now entwined with a man who could provide her everything she had ever wanted. She had it all, and I was left behind, a shadow of the man I used to be. I tried to move on. I did, but it was hard. Every time I saw her name or heard about her new life, I felt a pang in my chest. I hated myself for loving her still, for not being able to let go. But how could I forget the woman who had promised me forever? How could I forget the dreams we had built together? Even if they had been nothing but illusions? I don't hate her. I can't, maybe I should, but I don't. I understand in a way. She was looking for something I couldn't give her. She wanted a life of comfort and security, and I couldn't blame her for that. But what hurts the most is knowing that her love for me was never as strong as I thought it was. It was conditional, and when the opportunity for something better came along, she chose it. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. The love we had, the promises we made, all of it feels like a dream now. I sometimes wonder if I was just a stepping stone for her, someone to help her find her way to something better. But I guess that's how life works sometimes, doesn't it? People come into your life, make promises, and then when the right opportunity arises, they move on, leaving you behind. And me? I'm still here trying to figure out who I am without her, trying to rebuild my life from the pieces she left behind. I suppose one day I'll find someone who will love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. But for now, I carry the weight of this lost love, one that was real for me, even if it never truly was for her. It all started when we were in high school. I was the quiet guy, the one who sat in the back of the classroom and barely spoke to anyone. But then there was her, Avery. She was the kind of girl who could light up a room with just a smile. I remember the first time I saw her, it was during our first year. She was laughing with her friends, her eyes sparkling. And I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just a crush, it was something deeper, something real. We had a few classes together, and I started to look forward to them every day, even though I barely had the courage to talk to her. She didn't even know I existed, not like that. I remember staring at her from across the room, hoping she might notice me, but never daring to say a word. Still, I found ways to make her laugh. Little moments when I'd answer a question or help out with something in class. Her voice, the way it made my heart race, kept me going, but I was too afraid to tell her what I really felt. Years passed, and somehow we kept running into each other. We had mutual friends, and sometimes we'd find ourselves talking in groups. There were moments when it felt like she saw me, really saw me, like maybe she was starting to notice. But she never said anything, and I never had the guts to take the next step. Maybe it was because I didn't think I was worthy, or maybe I was afraid of ruining the one thing we had, the possibility of something that wasn't quite real, but felt so close to it. Then in our senior year it happened. It was the night of prom. I had never planned to ask her to go. I thought she'd be with someone else anyway, maybe even her ex. They had this complicated relationship, and I had heard whispers about them throughout the years. But that night, as I stood at the edge of the dance floor, I saw her across the room looking beautiful, more than I had ever seen her before, and in that moment I knew I had to do something. I made my way over to her, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Avery," I said, and she looked up surprised. "You look amazing tonight," I told her, suddenly feeling stupid for not having said anything sooner. She smiled, and for a second, I thought I saw something in her eyes, a spark maybe. She laughed softly and said, "Thanks, you don't look so bad yourself." We started talking. Not about anything special, Just casual stuff, like the dance, the decorations, what we were going to do after prom. But it felt different this time. She was actually talking to me, looking at me like maybe I wasn't invisible. It felt like a small victory. After a while, the conversation shifted, and we ended up outside away from the noise. That's when she told me about her ex, the one she had never really gotten over. He had come back into her life recently, and she was torn. She had always loved him, and he was the one who had hurt her. But now he was saying all the right things. She wasn't sure what to do, and in that moment, I felt like someone had just kicked me in the stomach. It was the first time she had ever opened up to me like that. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that I could be the one who made her happy. But instead, I just listened. I didn't want to be the guy who pushed her into something she wasn't ready for. But I also couldn't help but feel jealous, watching her talk about him with such longing in her eyes. I wasn't the one who had been there for her when she needed someone. And now I was too late. The night ended, and I left prom feeling more confused than ever. We exchanged a few texts after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. She was still polite, still friendly, but there was a distance I couldn't close. A few weeks later, she started seeing him again, her ex, the one who had hurt her, the one who had come back, and she had fallen into his arms like nothing had ever happened. I watched from afar as she posted pictures with him, as they went on dates, as everything seemed to fall into place for them. It hurt, more than I had ever imagined it would. It felt like I had spent all those years hoping for something that was never meant to be. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I didn't have the right. She had made her choice, and I had to accept it, even if it tore me apart inside. The hardest part was knowing that I was just a shadow in the background of her life, watching her live out a story I had always dreamed of being a part of. Time went on, and I kept my distance. I tried to move on, but how do you forget someone you've loved for years? I threw myself into my studies, my work, and every time I thought I was starting to heal, there was a reminder, a photo, a memory, a fleeting thought that would bring me back to her. Then one day she reached out to me. It had been months since we had spoken, and I wasn't sure why she was suddenly contacting me. She apologized for everything, for not noticing me sooner, for everything she had put me through. She told me that she had realized her ex wasn't the right one for her, that she had made a mistake, and she wanted to see where things could go between us. My heart soared at first, but then doubt crept in. Could I really trust her again? After everything, after the years of waiting, was it even worth it? But I wanted so badly to believe her, to believe that she had finally come back to me, so I agreed to meet her. The moment I saw her, I knew something was wrong. She wasn't the same, and neither was I. The girl I had loved all those years was gone, and the one sitting across from me was someone who had been through too much to be the same. We talked, but the connection wasn't there. I could see it in her eyes. She was still holding on to something from the past. She said she was sorry for hurting me, but I could tell that her heart wasn't fully in it. She had come back, but only because she had nowhere else to turn, and that was when I realized something that had been there all along. I had never truly been her choice. She had always been torn between the past and the future, between him and me. And in the end, she couldn't choose me, not fully. I walked away that day, finally letting go of something that had been holding me captive for years. It was hard, and it hurt more than I could ever explain, but I had to accept that she had made her decision, and now it was my turn to make mine. I still think about her sometimes. What could have been, what should have been. But I've learned that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you have to let go, even when it feels like the hardest thing in the world. It all started when I first saw her at that small cafe down the street. I wasn't expecting anything, certainly not to meet her. She was sitting by the window reading a book, a quiet smile on her face. She looked like she was lost in a world of her own, but somehow, her presence filled the whole room. It wasn't just her beauty, it was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her eyes. I couldn't take my eyes off her, but I didn't have the courage to approach her at first. Then I did something impulsive. I walked up to her and asked if she was reading something interesting. She looked up, and for the first time, I saw a warmth in her gaze that made me feel at ease. She smiled and said it was a book she loved. We started talking about books, about life, and before I knew it, hours had passed. From that moment, something clicked between us, like two pieces of a puzzle finding their place. I didn't think much about it at the time. I just enjoyed being around her. Every day I would go to that cafe, hoping to see her, and she'd be there almost like she was waiting for me too. We began to spend more time together, walking through the park, grabbing coffee, sharing secrets about our lives. She was different from anyone I'd ever met. She had this kind of light around her that made everything seem brighter. I was falling for her slowly but surely, but then things started to change. One evening, she told me she had a meeting with her manager. I didn't think much of it. I figured she was pursuing something with her art, something I didn't fully understand. She was an artist, a painter, and had been gaining attention for her unique style. Her work was beautiful, but I never realized how much it would change her. Soon, she began to get more and more invitations, exhibitions, interviews, social events. I was happy for her, of course, but at the same time, I felt like I was losing her. I wasn't part of that world, that glittering world where she was starting to belong. I wasn't a part of her success, and that hurt. I tried to be supportive, but the more famous she became, the more distant she seemed. There was one night after one of her exhibitions when I knew things were different. We had been texting all evening, and she said she wanted to talk. I met her at the same cafe, but when I arrived, there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She was sitting there with a man I didn't know, his arm resting casually on the back of her chair. She introduced him to me. "This is Adrian," she said with a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. "He's a big fan of my work." I tried to hide the shock, the jealousy building up in my chest. I shook his hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was everything I wasn't, charming, confident, successful, and she seemed so comfortable around him, so different from the girl I knew. That night after Adrian left, I tried to talk to her about it. I told her how I was feeling, how it seemed like she was slipping away. She told me I was being paranoid, that I had nothing to worry about, but I knew better. There was a connection between them, something more than just admiration for her art. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. The next few weeks were a blur. She became busier than ever, attending more events, posing for photos with Adrian by her side. I started to feel invisible. Every time I reached out to her, it felt like I was interrupting something. I wasn't part of her new life. It was as if she had forgotten who I was, or worse, forgotten what we had. And then it happened. One evening, I went to her apartment to surprise her with dinner, something we used to do often. I thought maybe if I showed her that I still cared, we could find our way back to each other. But when I opened the door, I froze. She was there with Adrian, laughing, holding a glass of wine, their faces close. I felt like my heart had been ripped from my chest. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at each other. It was no longer just admiration. It was something deeper, something I wasn't a part of. I walked away that night not saying a word, but my mind was racing and my chest felt tight. I wasn't angry at her. I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. I had let her slip away while I was still holding on to something that no longer existed. I was a fool thinking that love alone could keep us together. The next few days she tried to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to answer her calls. I needed space, I needed time to think. I had to accept that things had changed, that she had changed. I wasn't the man she needed anymore, and I wasn't sure if I had ever really been. She had grown, she had blossomed into someone else, someone I didn't know anymore. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I saw her on a magazine cover. Her face was everywhere now, on billboards and interviews. Adrian was by her side in every photo, and it hit me all over again. She was no longer the girl I knew. She had become this version of herself, a version I couldn't reach. She had everything now: success, fame, the admiration of so many. And she had Adrian. It was over. I couldn't hate her. I loved her too much for that, but I had to accept the truth. She had moved on. Maybe in a way I had to. I had to let her go, even though it felt like I was losing a part of myself. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I would always love her, even if she no longer loved me the same way, even if she never remembered the person I used to be to her. In my heart, she would always be that girl I met at the cafe, the one who changed my life forever. I remember the first time I saw her name pop up on my screen. Her username was Fate Whispers, and it caught my attention instantly. I didn't know why. But something about the combination of those words made me pause. So I clicked on her profile, and that's when it all started. Her picture wasn't like all the others I had seen. She wasn't posing in a way that screamed for attention. There was something quiet about her, a sort of peace in the way she smiled. Her eyes were soft, but there was something behind them. Something I couldn't quite place. But it intrigued me. She looked like someone who had a story, and that made me want to know more. We started chatting. Nothing fancy, just some light conversation. The usual, "Hey, how's your day?" Followed by, "What are you into?" But the thing that struck me right away was how easy it was to talk to her. We weren't just talking about trivial stuff, no. It felt like we were opening up to each other in ways I hadn't done with anyone before. It was as if we'd known each other for years, even though we had just met. As the days turned into weeks, we started to share more personal things. I told her about my dreams, my fears, the little things that made me who I was. And she listened, really listened. She told me about her life too, but she always had this way of keeping certain things to herself, like there were parts of her that weren't meant to be revealed just yet. I could tell that she was cautious, but it didn't bother me. In fact, I found it charming. Then the messages started to come more often. We would talk for hours at a time, sometimes until the early morning. Every time I saw a notification from her, my heart would skip a beat. It was crazy, but I knew deep down that I was falling for her. She was kind, funny, and there was an undeniable warmth in her words. We laughed at the same jokes, got lost in the same songs, and even found comfort in the same silence. We talked about meeting in person one day. She said it with the same casual tone that she used for everything, but I could tell there was something real behind it. I believed it. I thought it was only a matter of time before we'd meet, before we'd take that next step and become something more. But life, it doesn't always go according to the plans you make, does it? There was one night that everything changed. I'll never forget it. We had been talking for hours like we usually did, but she seemed distant. Her responses were shorter, less engaged. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe she was just tired. But then she told me something that I didn't expect. "I met someone," she said so casually, as if she was talking about the weather. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. My heart dropped into my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to keep the panic from seeping in. She hesitated, then explained. "I've been spending a lot of time with someone from my real life. I didn't want to tell you, but I think there's something there. I'm sorry if this hurts you." And just like that, the world around me seemed to tilt. I didn't know how to process it. I couldn't understand how she could say this so nonchalantly, as if I wasn't a part of her life anymore. She had become so important to me, and yet in the blink of an eye, she was slipping away. I remember sitting there staring at the screen, feeling the weight of it all. She didn't love me, not like I loved her anyway. She was moving on, leaving me behind. And no matter how much I wanted to believe it wasn't real, it was. She had made a choice, and that choice wasn't me. I asked her if we could still be friends, if we could stay in touch, but she didn't answer right away. She told me that it wouldn't be fair to either of us, that things between us had to change. And in that moment, it felt like my heart shattered piece by piece. It's funny. I never saw it coming. I thought we had something special, something that couldn't be broken by distance or time. But sometimes things just aren't meant to be. She tried to soften the blow by saying that it wasn't my fault, that it wasn't because of anything I had done. She said she just wasn't in the place to give me what I needed. She didn't want to lead me on, and I get it, I do, but that doesn't stop the sting of it. I spent the next few days in a haze, replaying every conversation, every word we had shared, trying to figure out where it went wrong. But there was nothing to figure out. It was just life. People change. Feelings fade. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just how things were. She eventually stopped texting me altogether. I still think about her sometimes. The girl I thought I would meet in person one day. The girl I thought we would write a future together. But life has a way of twisting things, doesn't it? I don't regret meeting her. Not for a second. But I do wish things had turned out differently. I wish we could have had more time, more conversations, more moments where I could have made her laugh or shared my dreams with her. But in the end, I learned that sometimes love is just a fleeting thing. Like a passing shadow. You hold on to it while you can, but you can't force it to stay. And as for her, I hope she finds what she's looking for. I hope she's happy. Maybe our paths will cross again someday, or maybe not. But for now, all I have are the memories of the girl I thought would stay. I remember the first time I saw her. It was on a quiet evening, just another late-night scroll through the usual online forums. My name's Jack, by the way. Nothing particularly special about me, just a regular guy, living a somewhat ordinary life in a small town. Sometimes the internet was my escape, a way to break free from the monotony. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a distraction, really. Maybe a conversation to break up the hours. But then I saw her comment. It was on a post about a book I loved. And she mentioned the quote that I had always thought was the most profound line in the whole book. I don't know why, but it hit me. This girl had something different about her. I clicked on her profile and saw she was from another state far, far away. Not just a little distance, but a whole world away. Somewhere I could never reach. Still, I sent her a message. Something casual. Just an introduction. Hey, I saw your comment. You've got good taste in books. She responded almost immediately, and from there, our conversations grew like wildfire. We started talking about books, movies, music. Our thoughts seemed to mirror each other so easily, so naturally. It didn't matter that we were miles apart. In a way, it was like we were closer than most people who lived just a street over. The hours would slip away while we talked about everything and nothing, laughing at the same jokes, debating over trivial things like, what movie was the best to watch on a rainy afternoon? Her name was Lily, and her voice, though I couldn't hear it at first, was like a melody that danced through her words. There was something in her writing, her tone, the way she expressed herself that made her feel so real, so warm. It was like she was speaking directly to me, and I knew her thoughts before she even typed them. I couldn't help but think that maybe this was something more than just a fleeting online connection. Weeks passed, then months. It became a part of my routine, waking up and looking forward to our conversations, checking my phone, hoping there'd be a message from her. And every time there was, my heart would beat just a little bit faster. It wasn't just about the things we talked about anymore. It was about her, the way she made me feel, the way she cared so deeply about the world, about people, and even about things that seemed small, like how the rain looked from her window, or the way the wind sounded through the trees. The way she described the world was like seeing it for the first time. One night I decided to tell her something I hadn't told anyone. I had this fear that by saying it I'd make everything awkward, but in the end I couldn't keep it in any longer. I told her about how over the past months I had fallen for her. I told her that even though we were miles apart, I couldn't help but think of her every day, that I imagined what it would be like if we could just meet even for a moment. I didn't expect a reply right away, but she did. And when I saw her message light up on my screen, I held my breath. Jack, I feel the same way. Those words hit me like a wave. I didn't know what to say at first, so I just sat there staring at the screen. How could this be real? How could we, two people who had never met in person, be feeling this way? We began to talk about it more, and after some time, the distance between us didn't seem so insurmountable. We both knew it wasn't going to be easy, and yet, neither of us was willing to let go of what we had started. There was something about our connection that felt destined. It wasn't just about the words on the screen. It was about the way we understood each other, about how we were able to support each other through the struggles of life, even from thousands of miles apart. But eventually, I couldn't stand just talking to her on a screen anymore. I needed to see her, to hear her voice, to be near her. So I made a decision. I saved up every penny I could and booked a flight. It wasn't just a visit. It was something I had been working toward for months. A leap of faith into something I believed was worth every bit of risk. When the day finally arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I'd never been so excited yet so terrified at the same time. I remember standing in the airport, my heart racing as I waited for the announcement. I tried to keep calm, but every minute felt like an eternity. And then finally the moment came. I saw her. She was standing there, looking around, not noticing me yet. I don't think she saw me until I was right there, standing in front of her. For a moment, neither of us moved. Time seemed to stop. And then she smiled. The kind of smile that makes you believe in magic. The kind of smile that could light up the whole world. Without a word, we walked toward each other and just hugged. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was just perfect. It felt like the world had finally aligned. And in that embrace, I knew every mile, every second, every message we had shared had been leading to this moment. The next few days were a whirlwind. We explored her city, talked about everything and nothing, laughed until we couldn't breathe. It was like the internet connection we'd shared had been real, had come to life in that one moment. Being with her in person felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was like we had always known each other, even before we had met. But of course the time came when I had to leave to return to my life and my routine. The distance felt even harder after being with her. But I knew that this love, this thing we had was real, and no matter how far apart we were, I believed that we would make it work. So we kept going. The distance didn't matter. Our bond was stronger than ever. We visited each other whenever we could, and every time we had to say goodbye, it got a little easier because we both knew it wasn't forever. This was just the beginning of our story, and I couldn't wait to see where it would go. And now, even after all the challenges, all the time apart, we're still here, still going strong. And every day I'm more certain than ever that love knows no boundaries, no distance, no time, it just is. It all began when I first started working at this small marketing agency. I was fresh out of college, eager to prove myself, and a little nervous about stepping into the professional world. The office was buzzing with activity, filled with the type of people who seemed so confident and seasoned. But there was one person who stood out to me from the moment I walked in, Mia. Mia was part of the creative team. She was always surrounded by a flurry of sketches, ideas, and passion. Her desk was full of color, bright sticky notes, bold posters, and a few plants she tended to like they were her babies. She had this air of someone who was always in the middle of something important, and yet there was a certain warmth to her presence. I never really talked to her at first, but every time our paths crossed in the office, I felt this pull. Maybe it was the way she laughed, or how she would always brighten up a meeting with her insights, or maybe it was the way she would smile at me when I passed by her desk. It didn't take long before we had to work on a project together. We were assigned to collaborate on a new campaign. I remember feeling a little nervous, wondering if she'd be as intimidating up close as she seemed from afar. But when I sat down next to her for our first meeting, something shifted. She wasn't at all what I expected. She was open, easygoing, and sharp. Her ideas were brilliant, and it was clear that she was passionate about what she did. We spent hours bouncing ideas back and forth. At first, it was all about the work, brainstorming, drafting plans, discussing strategies. But slowly, as we spent more time together, I started noticing little things about her. How she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. How she'd hum quietly under her breath when she was excited about an idea. How her eyes lit up when something clicked. One day, after a long meeting, we ended up walking out together. We weren't even sure where we were going, but we both needed a breather. We found ourselves at a small cafe nearby, sitting at a corner table sipping coffee. It was a quiet moment, and I was surprised at how comfortable it felt. We talked about everything, our childhoods, our dreams, our favorite movies. And I started to realize that Mia wasn't just someone I worked with. She was someone I genuinely enjoyed being around. As days passed, our bond grew. We spent late nights together working on the campaign. But those nights never felt like work. The way she would make me laugh, or how she'd encourage me when I doubted myself, made everything seem effortless. I found myself looking forward to those late nights. I wanted to hear her thoughts, to see her smile, to share those small victories with her. It wasn't long before the lines between work and friendship blurred. We'd talk even when we weren't working, about silly things, about life. I'd catch myself thinking about her when we weren't together. I'd find little excuses to talk to her, to share a moment. I didn't know if she felt the same way. I didn't want to assume. But the more I got to know her, the more I realized she wasn't just my colleague or my friend anymore. Then one evening, we were walking to the parking lot after a particularly long day. It was late, the sky darkening, and there was a soft chill in the air. Mia was talking about something funny that had happened at the office, her voice light and carefree. As we reached our cars, I don't know what made me do it, but I stopped and turned to her. "Mia," I said, a little unsure, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I really like you. Not just as a coworker, but as someone I want to spend time with. More than that, actually." She stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide for a moment. My heart skipped a beat, thinking I might have said the wrong thing. But then she smiled softly, almost shyly, and said, "I was hoping you'd say that." In that moment, it felt like time stopped. My heart was racing, but the relief and joy that followed were overwhelming. She liked me too. After everything we'd shared, after all those little moments, she felt the same. That was the moment things shifted. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were something more. And from that point on, we found ourselves balancing the fine line between work and what was growing between us. We were still the same team, working side by side. But now there was an unspoken understanding, a connection that was deeper than before. As we navigated the days, our relationship blossomed in the most natural way. We'd sneak little moments together during lunch breaks, sending each other messages just to check in. Even when we weren't working on a project together, we found reasons to support each other. Mia became not just a partner at work, but someone I trusted completely, someone I could rely on. I think the hardest part came when we had to face the realities of what our growing relationship meant. We both knew we had to be careful. There were office dynamics, expectations, and the risk of it all becoming too complicated. But the more we tried to distance ourselves, the more we realized that what we had was something real, something worth pursuing. One evening, after our project wrapped up successfully, Mia and I took a walk again, this time with no deadlines hanging over us, no pressures from work. As we walked through the quiet streets, the world around us felt peaceful. "I'm glad we did this," she said, her voice quiet but full of meaning. "Me too," I replied, looking at her with a smile. "I think we make a pretty great team, don't you?" She grinned, nudging me with her shoulder. "We do. And I think we've got something else going on, too." And just like that, I knew we weren't just a team at work anymore. We were a team in life. It was funny looking back. All the little moments, the quiet glances, the hours of collaboration, it all led to this, to us. And the best part was, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I'll admit, I've never been the most outgoing person. I guess you could say I'm the type who'd rather stay in the background and watch the world move around me. That's how I ended up living in the same neighborhood for most of my life. Quiet, calm, predictable. It was always the same faces walking by, and among them there was her. Her name is Emily. We've lived on the same street for years, but I'd never really spoken to her. She was always so full of life. Everyone seemed to know her, while I preferred to stay under the radar. It's funny how you can be so close to someone and yet so far at the same time. It all started one spring afternoon. I was walking home from the library, my favorite place to escape the mundane world. It had been a quiet, uneventful day just like any other, but then as I turned the corner to my street, I saw her. She was sitting on the front steps of her house, legs crossed, a book in her hands. She was so focused on her reading that she didn't even notice me standing there for a moment. But when I finally got the courage to walk past her, she glanced up and smiled. It was one of those smiles that makes you forget how to breathe for a second. The kind that makes you think the universe is reminding you that something magical can happen on an ordinary day. I mumbled something like, "Hey," and kept walking, my face burning red. I wasn't good at this, at talking to people, especially girls like her. She was so alive in ways I could never seem to be. The next few days were the same, me walking by her house, her sitting on those same steps reading her book, giving me the occasional smile when our eyes met. But we never really spoke beyond those brief moments. I couldn't quite bring myself to approach her. Every time I saw her, my heart would race, and I'd get all tangled up in my thoughts. But something happened one afternoon. I had just come from the park and was passing by her house again. I had my headphones in, but I was too distracted to really listen to the music. As I got closer, I noticed something different. She was standing up, not sitting on the steps. She was looking straight at me. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey, I've seen you around a lot," she said, her voice soft but warm. I was taken off guard. I hadn't expected her to speak to me, let alone this. I pulled my headphones down quickly, my mind racing. Yeah. I live just down the street," I said, stumbling over my words. I pass by a lot, I guess." She chuckled, and it made me feel a little lighter. "I know. You seem like you're in a hurry all the time," she teased. "You don't have time to stop and chat?" Her words took me by surprise. I had never imagined she noticed me that much, let alone cared enough to speak to me. I'm not really good at talking to people. I'm kind of shy," I admitted, feeling silly as soon as I said it. I had never opened up like this to anyone before. She looked at me with kind eyes. "I get it, I'm shy too. People think I'm this outgoing person, but it's just a mask," she said, as if she was confessing a secret. I blinked, trying to wrap my head around what she just said. She was shy, really? "But you seem so confident," I blurted, not knowing why it mattered to me so much. She smiled, a little sad, a little amused. "Maybe I just look confident, but I'm not. I'm actually really scared most of the time." That's when it hit me. We were more alike than I had ever realized. It was as if we were both living in a world of our own making, too afraid to connect because we thought the other person wouldn't understand. We started talking more after that day. Not much at first, but gradually we'd cross paths more often. Sometimes she'd be out walking her dog. Sometimes I'd be walking home. And we'd exchange awkward pleasantries that somehow felt like the beginning of something. She told me about her love for books, her favorite stories, and how much she loved the feeling of getting lost in a different world. I told her about my love for music, how I could always lose myself in a song and forget everything else. It was strange but comforting, knowing that we shared this secret world of shyness and quiet moments. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air turned cooler, I was walking home from the park, and I saw her again sitting on her steps. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked up to her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Mind if I sit with you?" She looked up, her eyes soft, like she was waiting for me. "Of course not," she said, moving her book aside. "It's nice to have company." We sat there together, not talking much, but somehow that felt okay. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we were both just there, experiencing this moment together without needing words to explain it. As the evening grew darker, I noticed she was looking at me differently. Her smile was different this time, warmer. I couldn't ignore it. Any longer, I had to say it. "Emily, I don't know if you've noticed, but I think I'm falling for you," I said before I even realized I was saying it. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she laughed, a soft, nervous laugh, and looked down at her hands. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered almost to herself. "I've been feeling the same way." My heart leaped. "You mean, you like me?" I asked, half in disbelief. She nodded, her cheeks turning pink. "I do, I've always been so scared to admit it. I thought you'd never notice." "I was scared too," I confessed, laughing nervously. "I guess we're both just a little shy." We shared a quiet laugh, the kind of laugh that made everything feel right. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them. Sometimes they come when you stop overthinking and just let go. After that, we spent more time together. We walked to the park, shared our favorite books and songs, and laughed at our silly conversations. I no longer had to wonder if she felt the same way, because every moment spent with her made it clearer. And so our story unfolded, slowly but surely. Two shy souls who finally found each other in a world that was too big to navigate alone. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough for me. It started with a study trip. Just a typical school excursion, or at least that's what I thought. To be honest, I wasn't even that excited about it. A weekend away from the usual grind of schoolwork. Lectures and crowded classrooms, yeah. It sounded nice, but it didn't exactly spark any fire in me. I don't remember the first time I saw her. Not in the way you might expect. We'd crossed paths before, in the halls, in group projects, but she was always a bit of a mystery to me. She had this quiet confidence, the kind of girl who didn't need to say much but had an undeniable presence. Her name was Emily. So there we were on this trip, about 30 of us, mostly classmates plus a couple of teachers. The destination was an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the countryside. It was meant to be a hands-on trip to study local history and ecology, but for me, it felt like another boring assignment to finish. We arrived late in the evening, the sky already bruising purple as we unloaded the bus. Emily and I were on opposite ends of the group, barely speaking at first. The night was cold and the air smelled fresh like earth and pine. We all gathered in the farmhouse's large dining room for some introductions and dinner. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes following us as we sat down. That night, after the professors gave their usual talks, we were all invited to roam around the farmhouse grounds, get to know the place. A few people split off in groups, but something about the silence outside the farmhouse caught my attention. I wandered a little farther from the group, lost in my thoughts when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, there she was, Emily. She was looking up at the stars, her dark hair catching the moonlight. The soft glow gave her a kind of ethereal look, something out of a painting. "Hey," I said a little too loudly, and she turned with a startled smile. "Hey," she replied, her voice warm but soft. We both stood there for a moment, neither of us knowing exactly what to say. It felt like something unspoken was hanging in the air, between us, something almost magnetic. "I didn't think anyone would come out here this late," I said, trying to sound casual. "Not with the cold and all." She shrugged, her eyes still on the sky. "Sometimes it's nice to just be by yourself for a bit, don't you think?" I nodded, more to myself than to her. "Yeah, I get that." The rest of the group was probably inside already, but Emily and I stayed out there for what felt like hours, just talking. About everything and nothing. We talked about our classes, our dreams, things that scared us, things that made us laugh. I had no idea why, but I felt like I could tell her things I hadn't told anyone else. There was something about her presence, something that made me feel like she understood. And in that moment, with the stars above us and the world silent around us, I started to feel it, the shift. I didn't know exactly what it was, but there was a kind of magic in the air that night. We walked back to the farmhouse together, side by side, in the quiet of the night. The next day, we found ourselves spending more time together. During our study sessions, we would exchange glances, and when our eyes met, it felt like we were sharing some kind of secret. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and I could tell she felt the same. There was an unspoken connection between us, something growing each moment we spent together. The days went by, and with each one I realized I was falling for her. It wasn't a sudden thing, but a slow and steady process. The way she laughed at my stupid jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she loved. Every little thing about her started to feel like it was pulling me in deeper. One evening after dinner, the group was gathering for a bonfire. The air was cool, and the flames from the fire cast long, flickering shadows across the field. I stood by the edge of the group, watching the flames crackle, when Emily appeared beside me, her presence as natural as ever. She didn't say anything at first. We just stood there watching the fire. After a moment, she took a deep breath. "You know," she started, her voice soft, "this whole trip has been kind of amazing." I turned to her, surprised by the depth in her words. "Yeah, I didn't expect it to be like this either." She smiled, and it was one of those rare smiles. Real, unguarded. "I think it's because it's different. Different from anything we've known. Being here away from everything, it's like we're in another world." I felt my heart race at her words, at how she seemed to understand exactly what I was feeling. "I get that. It's like the world outside doesn't matter when you're here." She looked at me, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yeah, like it's just you and me. Like the world's not so big anymore." In that moment, something shifted. The words didn't matter anymore. There was only the space between us, the unspoken understanding. Without thinking, I took a step closer to her, and she didn't step back. The fire crackled between us, but all I could focus on was the way she looked at me. Her eyes, soft and trusting, the way her lips parted slightly, as though waiting for something. I reached for her hand, the contact so simple yet so powerful, and when our fingers touched, it felt like everything had led to this one moment. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us under the moonlit sky. "Emily," I whispered, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. In the way she looked at me, I knew she felt it too. Without another word, I leaned in and our lips met. It was slow at first, unsure, but as our kiss deepened, I felt everything I hadn't been able to say, everything that had been building between us. The rest of the world, the trip, the people, it all disappeared. It was just us together in that moment, and in the days that followed, we were inseparable. We shared our dreams and fears, our hopes for the future. We laughed, we argued. We discovered each other in ways that felt both thrilling and comforting. By the end of the trip, I knew something had changed. We weren't the same people who had arrived at that farmhouse days ago. We had grown together in a way that felt like we'd known each other forever. And when we left back to the noise and bustle of the city, I knew that what had begun there under the stars, in that quiet countryside farmhouse, was not just a passing infatuation. It was something real, something that had blossomed in the space between silence and conversation, in the shared moments of our hearts speaking louder than words. We had started as strangers, and now we were something more, something I couldn't quite explain, but something I was willing to explore for as long as we could. It all started on a Tuesday night. I didn't plan on going to the movies. In fact, I was supposed to be at home catching up on work. But something about the weather, the way the rain tapped lightly against my window, pulled me out the door. I found myself walking into the theater, unsure of what I even wanted to watch. The film playing was a romantic drama, one I hadn't heard of, but I figured I'd give it a try. It was the kind of story where the kind of person who's always slightly cynical about love, like me, would roll their eyes at the beginning but might end up wrapped up in it. I bought my ticket and made my way into the half-empty theater, the air smelling faintly of buttery popcorn and the anticipation that always comes with watching a movie in the dark. I found my seat a little to the side, just out of direct view of the screen. Perfect for someone who didn't want to draw attention to themselves. And then, of course, she walked in. She stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the room. For some reason, I noticed her right away, the way her eyes seemed to glimmer, even under the dim lights. She was alone too, which was oddly comforting. I wasn't the only one who just wanted to escape for a little while. She walked toward an empty seat across the aisle from me, just a row ahead. I thought maybe she'd sit somewhere else, but she didn't. She chose the seat directly across, giving me just enough room to feel like I wasn't crowding her, but still close enough for my heart to start racing a little. I didn't know why. It wasn't as if I was someone who usually cared about a stranger sitting nearby, but something about her presence. It was different. The film started and I tried to focus on it, but my attention kept drifting. It was one of those movies with a slow build-up, where you can't tell if it's going to be beautiful or just agonizingly boring. The plot was about two people meeting at a crossroads in their lives, uncertain of what comes next, struggling with their own fears and dreams. There was a scene, a quiet one, where the characters just sat in a park after an argument, unsure of whether they could continue their relationship. The rain was pouring down, but they didn't move, choosing to stay. Even though they were both physically and emotionally drenched, it was an intense moment, and the theater was completely silent, save for the distant sound of rain in the background. And then I heard it, a soft laugh from across the aisle. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I looked over and there she was, laughing just a little, almost like she couldn't believe what was happening on the screen. Her laugh wasn't mocking, though. It wasn't sarcastic. It was something else. It was the kind of laugh that said, "I get it, I feel it too." I didn't know what made me do it, but I leaned forward just enough to catch her eye. She looked back at me, startled at first, but then she smiled. Not the kind of smile you give a stranger because you have to, but the kind of smile that comes from recognizing someone in the middle of a crowded room and someone who just might understand. "Crazy, right?" she whispered, still watching the screen. "Yeah," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "I mean, it's like they're just sitting there in the rain, like nothing else matters." She nodded, her eyes flicking back to the movie. "I don't know if I could do that," she said quietly, almost to herself. I leaned back in my seat, but I couldn't stop thinking about her words. I don't know if I could do that. There was something in the way she said it, something soft but strong, a vulnerability wrapped in a shield of quiet confidence. I didn't know her and she didn't know me, but there was a connection in that moment, something intangible but real. The movie went on, but the distance between us had already started to close. After that scene, we started talking. We whispered through the quieter parts of the film, about the characters, the way they seemed to struggle in ways we could understand. We talked about the rain in the movie, how it almost seemed to mirror our own lives sometimes. Unpredictable, overwhelming, but necessary for growth. By the time the movie ended, I felt like we had shared something deeper than just a film. She was the first to stand up, but she didn't hurry. She lingered a bit, like she wasn't quite ready to leave yet. I couldn't blame her. Neither was I. "Hey," I said, standing up as well. "Do you want to get a coffee or something? I know a place nearby that's open late." She looked at me, her expression thoughtful for a second. Then she smiled again, the same knowing smile. "Yeah," she said. "I think I'd like that." We walked out of the theater together, stepping into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, but the street still gleamed from the downpour. We found a small cafe, the kind with a cozy corner and soft lighting, and talked for hours. We talked about everything, the movie, life, dreams, fears. We even talked about that one scene in the film and how sometimes it feels like we're all just waiting for someone to sit with us in the rain. I'm not sure when it happened, But somewhere along the way, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just a chance encounter anymore. It felt destined, like we'd met for a reason. Like those two characters in the movie, we had found ourselves at a crossroads. But unlike them, we weren't afraid to take the next step. That night, we parted with the promise to meet again. But the truth was, I already knew I'd see her again. Something about the way the rain had made us stop and notice each other told me that this wasn't just some fleeting moment. This was the beginning of something real.